Yeah, I mean, there was a few points I wanted to make in this. I think this is a good time to get it out there for people to understand what we're judging and what we get out of this experience, I think. I even thought about talking about maybe the particular setup you need to listen to this on, because I don't think you're going to get the right experience listening to it on your earbuds.
No.
Or because I don't know if that's understood, or like in your car. This is like sit down listening experience kind of stuff that we're talking about, right?
Sure. Yeah, definitely earbuds are not for critical listening. I think with Spotify and all the accessibility to music just becomes something you put on in your car in the background. What we're talking about is don't do anything else. Sit on the couch. Ideally, it should be on a stereo, and it doesn't really matter how expensive your stereo is.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, the listening experience that we go through is, because we've tried a lot of different things. We've tried wired connection. That was also like wired from my phone to receiver. We know Bluetooth is lossy. It does not give you the depth of field, the sound stage that you're looking for with Bluetooth. After a lot of experimenting with my receiver, the Onkyo receiver, we decided that AirPlay was the best sounding experience, even versus wired.
I wouldn't say that's 100% true. I think AirPlay is the best wireless experience. If you can go, I think the problem with the wired connection we were doing is we were converting it from USB, whatever the iPhone is, to RCA. And whatever the conversion was happening, something wasn't right. It was like summing it to mono, or it didn't sound good or correct.
Right.
Objectively, there is a more complicated setup you can do where you can stream completely lossless audio over your network through your computer. That's a little bit more involved. You have to have an application like iTunes, or actually I don't think iTunes is supported. Tidal or Qobuz, they support 24-bit 192. And then you use an application to stream it over your network to your receiver, and it's completely lossless. So that'll beat AirPlay. It's a little bit more involved with the setup, and you're not always going to find everything you're looking for on those. It's like the setup we had at our parents' house.
Right.
But it's completely lossless. And I absolutely hear a difference between, I think Spotify is not great on its own, and then doing it over Bluetooth is even worse. AirPlay is definitely better than that, but the network stream is the best.
Of course.
Now, of course, the better receiver you have, it's going to make a difference, and then the speakers. But if you can stream lossless, you're starting with a better foundation overall. I think anyone has the capability to set that up, to be honest. If you can set up Bluetooth from your phone to your receiver, you can set the network setup.
Sure.
It's like you said, Bluetooth is lossy. AirPlay is still lossy, and Apple is very obscure and vague about what it's actually doing. So you never really know what you're getting with AirPlay completely. But it definitely sounds better than Bluetooth. So I think they're being truthful about
Apple says it's you're getting lossless with it.
I think it's 24-bit. I don't think the sample rate is 96K. I think it's 48. So it's kind of lossless.
I see what you're saying.
But the sample rate, I think the bit depth is more important than the sample rate. It's how many bits per sample you're getting. And I notice a difference on 24-bit compared to 16.
Sure.
So, the setup, yeah.
Go ahead.
Where were we going with that?
Well,
the setup is important, but
I think
how you're listening and what you're listening on to a degree does matter.
I think that people have to understand I think I'm just trying to make it understood what it is that we're doing and how the experience that we've had when you sit down in your living room and you have a floor standing speaker stereo setup, and the experiences we've had with the audio mixes. And once you sort of get into tune with how these things work and what you're listening for, it's not just sitting here judging. We're not judging the music or the artistry of the music. If you want that, go read Rolling Stone. I don't even understand how you judge somebody's music anyway. It's so subjective that the audio mix is more of a science. It's the mechanics, it's the structure of the music that you hear, not judging, the songwriting process and the chord structure like that. That's not what we are trying to do here at all. But one thing that I have noticed is that with this whole way of doing things, you kind of take your heart out of the picture, because I have albums here that I've picked to talk about that are not my favorite albums. And unfortunately, I have albums I absolutely adore, and they just don't sound that great from a production standpoint or from a mixing standpoint. And I have to admit that as a person, that this isn't what it should be. But it is what it is, and that's just being a bigger person and being able to admit it, that it doesn't sound that good. But those albums are still dear to me, and does it affect my listening experience? No, not really, because you love that music either way. Right. Yes, there is the other dimension that does come into it is you realize, man, I really wish they had done this properly, but that is what it is.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to hear an album that you love and all along you're like, you hadn't maybe really paid attention to how good it sounded just because you don't care, because I just love the song. But you can do both. You can say, I love this song, but also admit they didn't pay enough attention to how good it sounded, or something went wrong during the recording or mixing process where they dropped the ball and it sounds like crap. And that's okay. There's plenty of albums that are like that, and I'm still going to listen to them, even though I can admit they don't sound good. Right.
And what we are talking about here these are like the pinnacle examples, really. These are above average sounding songs or albums that you can sit down and listen to, and it has that high fidelity sense. It sounds like it's in the room. The mix is right. It's recorded right. It's not that it makes it the best music of that artist. It's just that this is the best structured music that they have.
The overall production value or quality, it's the best you can get.
Right.
But it might not be their best performance or their best artistic endeavor.
Of course. Yeah, and that's where I had to, once I kind of learned this stuff initially, you sort of taught me this whole thing, and then it was like this whole world opened up to me. And what happens to you is that you start really seeking music out that sounds really good. And it opens up other avenues for you, because you start to appreciate, like, man, listen to the mix on this, how dialed in it is. And it's bands you typically wouldn't listen to. Then you start to build this little library of stuff that sounds exceptional, which is so much more fun than just looking for that next song that you just want to listen for the hook and you just want to tap your foot and sing along. Yeah, you still have that, but now you gain this other sort of library where you're like, I know these albums that sound exceptionally good.
That reminds me of kind of like movies. There's movies for entertainment, and then there's film, which you watch to critically analyze. And music, you can listen on your earbuds and Spotify. It's convenient. You don't pay attention to how good it sounds. You just want to have the music on. But film, in music regard, is sitting down in your stereo and paying attention to all the details. And me having a sound engineering background to some degree, I mean, I went to school for some of it, or for a while, and worked in a studio. I can't help but pay attention to all that. And that's just the way my brain works, not just with music, but I notice everything. And it's a gift and a curse, because you can't unsee it. You can't unhear it. And once you hear that the cymbal sounds like crap, or maybe the kick drum's not there and you never noticed it before, but now you're going to notice it forever. So hopefully it doesn't ruin songs for people, but it might at first, because they never thought about it before. Well, like the Biffy Clyro video is a perfect example. I'd always loved all their albums, but I thought they generally sounded pretty good until I actually critically listened to them. They're not the worst sounding albums, but they're not great. Like, there's stuff that falls out of the mix. They're flat, they're narrow for the most part, but it still doesn't matter necessarily. I'm still going to listen to it.
Right. You still love that band.
Still love the band.
And I never, the film versus watching a film and watching a movie type of argument or analytical, that is, I should have thought of that. And that's a great analogy, that, you don't watch a Marvel film to analyze film. Yes, there is structure and storytelling and character development and all that. All that stuff is there, but it's not, Gone with the Wind. It's not Jaws. It's not films that are going to be revered forever and like, oh man, this is a pinnacle in writing. And that's a great analogy, because that's what we're doing here. And it's funny because, like, another thing I wanted to say was, you are going to break hearts in this, because same thing when I think Martin Scorsese came out and talked about how Marvel films they're a carnival ride. Yeah. It's a carnival. Like, you're there just to get on this roller coaster, go through all the motions, and get off and go, wow, that was fun. You don't walk away from it with a greater knowing of something. There is no existential meaning behind things like you would get out of some of the really great films. And unfortunately, that is lost on the masses. There's nothing you can do about that.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to see an entertaining movie that's just entertaining.
Right.
It's not going to challenge you.
Right.
I like some of the Marvel movies, but that's exactly what they are. It's like he said, a circus or a carnival ride. I don't walk away impacted or like moved or challenged in any way, but sometimes that's what you need. You can't always be doing one. I think it's good to have a balance of both. I tend to lean towards more of the film type movies that are more obscure and make you think about things, but I like to watch reality trash TV sometimes, or not very often, but sometimes you just got to unplug and turn your brain off. And with music, maybe it's a little bit the same way. Like, I wear my earbuds in the gym. Music has a lot of different utility.
Sure.
Not just critically listening, but it should be appreciated in all respects, in my opinion. Critically listening, vinyl is a whole other thing too, where we could dive into that too. That's the absolute listening experience, especially if it's a good pressing and it's a good album.
Well, that's sort of the key, right? Because there's a lot of people out there that think that just because it's vinyl, it sounds great.
No.
And that is not the case, because you have to know what the source was when the vinyl was made. Is the pressing good? And also, is the album even mixed right?
They sometimes mix it differently for the vinyl because I think they have to.
Yes.
And sometimes they base it on the CD master, which is going to sound about the same as the CD. It might sound a little bit texturally different because it's vinyl, but it's not going to sound that much better than a CD.
Right.
However, if they're using the original Lossless, if they recorded it in high resolution and they use that, it should sound incredible. But then again, if it's mixed like trash, no matter what you do, you can polish a turd. It's still going to be a turd.
And there's a lot
to consider.
There's a lot of things that go down the line too, because you talk about, it's the production, it's the vinyl, it's the record player, it's the receiver, the speakers, the room, your ear. Like, there are so many things in line that make things sound the way they do, and you don't really take that into consideration until you start diving in, and then when you start to get a finer ear for things, you're like, something doesn't sound right here. And that's when you can figure out, like, whatever it is. Maybe your speakers just aren't that good, or your source is bad, or, there's so many things.
That's a good point. The signal chain from the time it was recorded to the time it gets to your ear is long. And something could go wrong at any step. Some are probably more forgiving than others, but if you have a crappy instrument, no matter what you run it through, it's going to sound like shit.
Right.
Or if, you can start with the instrument and the player, and then it's the microphone, then it's the cable, then it's the preamp, and then it's whatever processing they're running it through, probably equalizer, compression, maybe some other outboard gear. And then it's going to get converted to digital and saved on a hard drive. And then when they mix it, they're probably going to convert it back to analog if they're mixing out of the box, and it's going to get converted again back to digital. It's all staying high resolution, but you're passing audio and converting it so many times, it might not sound exactly, and you probably won't ever notice this, but just working in a studio, this is how the guy I worked with was mixing. They would record it, and then he would mix it out of the box on the board, so not in the computer. So you are converting it back to analog and then back to digital again. And then they ship it off for mastering, and they're doing the same thing. So a lot happens during that process, and that's probably not even doing it justice. But after that point, and there's all kind of plugins and digital stuff processing, it's kind of endless about what can really happen. So consider all of that, and then by the time you get it on Spotify or whatever, then it's already been downsampled to MP3, so you're losing quality. But if you can keep it as high resolution as possible, that's ideal, because then you're getting kind of what it should really sound like. People don't realize how different a 320 MP3 can sound compared to the CD.
Well, talk about how when Apple finally released Lossless and the difference that made. I mean, I think there was a big difference there once Lossless came out. But again, we had the right listening experience. But do you want to say anything about Spotify versus Apple's law? Right now, Spotify doesn't have Lossless, as far as I know.
It's coming, allegedly. Their hi-fi, it's in the app. I know it is because people have seen it allegedly show up in their app temporarily. Apple is in leagues with Tidal and the other ones if they're truly doing lossless, which it seems like they are. So, but Spotify is kind of a lower tier right now because of that. You're still only getting MP3, and I don't know if they're actually going full lossless. I think you might only be getting, CD is lossless, but it's not high resolution, I guess is what you want to say. It's not 24-bit or high sample rate, although they might be doing that. Maybe that's what they're waiting for. Maybe they were only going to do CD and they saw what Apple did, and now they're like, well, we can't compete with that. We need to actually do...
So let's just talk a little bit about what it is that we're looking for while we're listening to it. I mean, maybe people have picked this up a little bit from our videos, but how are drums supposed to be staged? What are we listening for? Guitars, vocals. Maybe we can clear that air a little bit before we get into why we pick these albums.
I think mix-wise, what I'm looking for, and what you're looking for in a mix could be subjective too. There's people who like certain textures or punchiness on certain things, and maybe you don't like that on everything. But generally speaking, a good mix means that you don't lose anything when everything is playing at the same time.
So no instruments are falling out of the mix.
You shouldn't be able... Exactly. If the drums and you have guitars and vocals and bass and maybe some other instrumentation in, and like say during a chorus is usually when it's the busiest, you shouldn't have a fall off of, say, the kick drum, which is pretty common. And there could be things competing in the mix for that same space in the frequency range. But if it all stays consistent and you can hear everything individually, you don't have to kind of listen for like what happened to the guitar, where'd the kick drum go, that's a good sign of a good mix. And foundationally, if the drums sound right to you, everything else should kind of sit on top of them. And I think the bigger picture of what we do is look for like a visualization of the sound stage, meaning what is the positioning of the drums and the guitar in the mix. Typically, you'll have a kick drum. It's always going to be centered. And that should be kind of like the bottom of your mix. The snare is going to sit on top. Guitars are usually panned out to the left and the right if it's like a rock album. And then vocals kind of sit on top of that. So in my head, as I'm listening to it, I try to imagine where's the sound coming from? How deep is it? And then the first point I made is, does anything kind of disappear? Like if during the verse the drums sound clear, but then they're going heavier in the chorus, am I losing any of the drums? Like what's the balance of the volumes and how does everything sit together? It should kind of feel like a cohesive image.
Yes.
Is where I would start with what we're looking for.
I think it's well said, but I think also to add to it that not every song on, even if you find an album that a few songs sound really good, there could be other songs that kind of missed the mark. There are times where I feel like we've experienced that, where the consistency is not always 100%, but it could be 90%. Generally speaking, it's almost like they do a little bit more work on certain songs than others. So, with that being said, we've picked albums that we feel, well, we didn't really talk much about what we both picked, but I've picked certain albums for certain reasons, and you did yours. But anything else you want to add?
That's a good point about consistency. There are albums where you're like, they must have put all their effort into this, and there could be a lot of reasons for that too, as far as scheduling problems. They didn't mix it all at the same time, and it could be so many reasons. Sure, they're not consistent, especially on older things where you're working in all analog. There's going to be more inconsistencies for sure.
Right.
Even in some newer albums, I can think of a few where I'm like, the guitars don't sound the same as the other song, and sometimes that's intentional. They're using different snares, they're using different guitars, but then sometimes, even though you notice that, sometimes they just don't sound as good. So there could be a lot of variables. I guess one last note about that is, like we said before, we still love the songs even if they sound bad.
Of course.
I don't think ever there was an album that I love that sounded bad, and because it sounded bad, maybe not want to listen to it anymore. Now, if you have bad songs that also sound bad, that's going to make it even worse. But if you have a good sounding album and the songwriting's not so good, I'm like, I can work with that a little bit more because I can appreciate the production quality of it, maybe.
So go ahead, start yours off with your album there.
First album that came to mind, I was listening to this in the car, and I've listened to it on vinyl. I've listened to it in Lossless. It's one of the best sounding albums I've ever heard in my life. And I'm actually it's not a front to back album for me. It's like a 60-40. The first half, I'm like, maybe more than the first half. Maybe it's more like 70-30. Hozier's album, his latest release, Wasteland Baby. As soon as it starts, you know the drums sound good already. The kick drum is punchy. The textures on everything, on every track in the album, sound perfect. I have no criticism of anything.
Are you telling me you don't have to wait until it really kicks in to get a sense if the song's good or not? Oh, is that how that works?
And it doesn't even matter if the songs are good or not. Even the songs I'm not crazy about on the album, like, they sound consistent the whole way through. And this album's not as commercially successful as his last one, but that doesn't matter. I think the songs, he went in a slightly different direction, but the way it was recorded, and he still kept the same vibe as the last one, where it almost sounds like he's playing it live, and he might be on the album, like live as a band all at once. I don't know how they did it. I don't want to know.
That's magic.
That's how good it is.
It's got the magic.
There's some kind of allure about it. Like, I don't want to know how they record it, because once I kind of see the process, and I'm like, it kind of ruins the mystery of it. But
interesting.
I had some other notes on it. He wrote the entire album, which is pretty impressive. And I mean, the songs, the lyrics. If I had to pick an album, like best sounding album of all time, best overall mix, I would pick this.
Really?
I think. And he's not like my favorite artist of all time. He's probably in my top 10. I think he's a great songwriter and performer.
Yeah, I wish I had something to add to it. I know you have shown me this. I recognize the artwork, but it's been a while. I'd have to go back and listen to it.
On vinyl, I think it sounds better. That's the best experience you can get. Whatever pressing I bought, I'll have to find it, but It sounds better than the album. The kick drum, the drums, the way the vocals are layered in the chorus in the first song with the harmonies, the guitar work, the way it's recorded, I have nothing but praise for that album. There was a lot of criticism about it because people said he was trying to do the same thing as his last album, but the production quality on it is so good, I almost don't care about anything else. That's an album you could listen to just to demo speakers on.
Right.
And hear like how full and deep the depth on that album is really what gets it, and the texture of everything.
I just want to interrupt you for a second. When you just said that, that's another thing I wanted to just briefly say is that, these are albums that we've picked where you can demo things on and you can almost make bad speakers sound good with a lot of these albums in the, proverbial sense where you can, but this is demo worthy stuff, I think is what we're getting at.
It gives you a good standard to start with.
Yes. Yes.
I know how this album should sound because it sounds incredible. So if these speakers, it should sound even better. Or if you want to get a good idea of what the speakers can do, when new speakers aren't going to sound as good as speakers that are broken in, but it's a good starting point.
Okay.
Your turn.
My turn. All right. My first pick is Alice in Chains, The Devil Put Dinosaurs here. And for a couple of reasons. This was the first album that I think this came out in 2013. And I remember showing this to you. And I think at first you were a little like, I don't think it was really your style. But I remember you saying how good it sounded. You're like, and this must have been the time where you had kind of figured out what stuff should sound like. Maybe it was like a year later or something, 2014, 2015. And I remember always kind of carrying that, like, well, Tom always said this sounds really good. And I think that this kind of like set the marker for me of, what albums should sound like. And it is still an album that we will put on, for a demo. The song Stone it really kicks. It's got a lot of low end. It's there. I also like the fact that Jerry Cantrell went over this album with a baritone guitar, went back and played back over it. And I think you can hear that. It's subtle. It's a subtle thing, but it's one of those production things that I don't think has been done very often. I don't know how often somebody goes back and redoes their, plays their guitar. I'm not into that kind of stuff, but I think it really added another layer in there of sort of low end that you don't get from, and I think it is probably their best sounding work. And for me, this is one of my favorite albums of all time. And because I think this album spoke to me on a personal level. It deals with religion, relationships, maybe even from some songs I take maybe even political things. I don't know. That's just my take on the songs, but that's the beauty of lyrics you can interpret sometimes. But there's a lot of themes in it that really spoke to me. So this album is very personal to me. I think that's all I had else to say about it. If there's anything you wanted to add.
That's a dark album for sure. The themes, I think you captured all of them at a high level. And the sound of it, I can remember when you first showed me that album. And I remember thinking, I do remember when I realized, like, that might have been one of the first albums that I really started paying attention to as far as the production goes. One of the earliest ones I can remember, because that was probably around the time I was starting to work in the studio and starting to really take engineering a little bit more seriously. So it kind of came together at the right moment. I do still think that is that's a better sounding album. I didn't consider it for this list. I do really like that album. It's not a front to back album for me. I mean, I can't listen front to back without stopping, but I like most of the songs on it, and all of them sound consistently good. So,
yeah, I guess with that being said, I would add that this is a front to back album for me. And this album is really interesting also because most people that are Alice in Chains fans, they tend to be fans of the older stuff back when, when Lane was singing. There's nothing wrong with that music. I'm not knocking that. But it's not my Alice in Chains. Yes, I grew up listening to Man in the Box and everything off Dirt, and Dirt's a phenomenal album. But for some reason, when this kind of took off and they did Black Gives Way to Blue, that was when I really kind of rediscovered them as something different. It's this new Alice in Chains. And I don't know a lot of people that have like heard this album or listened to this album. It's so strange to me because there's a few songs that made it on the radio. Well, probably two. I think Stone and Voices was pretty popular, but nobody knows this album. I find that to be so strange.
They do seem more niche to me, at least, as far as like mainstream music goes, because they're not really accessible.
Newer stuff,
definitely not. Yeah, the Devil Ate Dinosaurs it just has an atmosphere to it that's not very welcoming because of how dark it is. And I think people might be put off by that. Like the song Voices, that's probably the most radio friendly song on the album, maybe Stone, but I think the themes and what they went for on that, they went to a dark place, and I love it. I love that they did that. But that's probably why not many people know it, because there's no like sexy hook or like, this is not a Marvel film album. This is not something the masses go line up for,
right,
and want to be entertained by. This is something you listen to like figure yourself out. It's a heavy album.
Yeah, I can't stress enough how personal this album was for me. Like the lyrics are not just nonsense. There is a couple songs where it is a little cryptic. You're like, I don't really know what this is really about, but definitely themes in there. Heavy religion, a lot of relationship stuff, personal trauma. It's all there. And I think that's when albums really do shine for you, is when they become personal. But that's more of a subjective thing. So.
Sure. When you can relate to it or put yourself in the songwriters, whatever they're singing about, if that relates to you, the production quality is not going to matter at all. It's all about the song.
Yeah.
But then if the production quality is really good, it's going to be like, going to pull you in even more, in my opinion. So.
All right. I got it. I'm done on that if you don't have anything else.
No.
All right. So what's your? I'll pull your next one up here before we start on it.
So we've talked about this one before. This is Avenged Sevenfold, Hail to the King.
Okay.
I had to pick it. We covered this in our Avenged Sevenfold video, so we don't have to spend too much time on this one. But this album, it's a front to back album for me. Actually a platinum certified album. I think it's their best selling album, actually, which makes sense because it's their most straightforward metal, I guess. When I first heard it, I kind of hated it because it was so different. I was expecting another City of Evil or something progressive, and then I heard the first couple songs. I didn't even bother with the rest of it until years later. The guitarist actually quoted, I pulled most of this from Wikipedia because they link to a lot of articles there, but he said sonically it's their biggest album, and I agree with that. We've both said it's the girthiest album they have.
It is.
It's punchy, it's deep. The performances are really good. It's just different from what they've done. It doesn't really fit in with their discography in a way because it's not the same as their other stuff, but in a way it does because it still sounds like them. But that, I don't really have much else to say on that one other than it's kind of similar to Hozier, where you can listen to it front to back. It's all consistent. It's got the same kind of texture and punch where you don't lose anything in the mix. Everything just it's pleasing to listen to because of how good it sounds. Like the textures of everything. So, and that's one of my favorite bands of all time, as we know.
Right.
So I had to pick that one as one of the, I would listen to that on any stereo, anytime, and people should be impressed, even if they don't like the music.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not a particular fan of them, as people may know from the other videos, but those songs there, yes, they set the bar. Hail to the King and Shepherd of Fire are like, those are like our demo songs. When we sit down to listen to something, we tend to put those on to kind of
to warm up.
Yeah, start us off. Yes, I agree. It's a that is a demo-worthy album.
One fun note, I didn't know Shepherd of Fire was a Call of Duty Zombies theme song for one of the games. It doesn't seem like that would be, but I don't know, maybe it does at the same time, but I think that, I just thought that was kind of funny because they have some kind of partnership or a good relationship with the developers. I think it's Treyarch or maybe it's Sledgehammer who makes Call of Duty games, or some of them. So they have multiple theme songs across those games.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that.
It's kind of a fun note, but that was really all I had for that one. We've talked about it enough.
Okay.
So
who do you know that's a bigger Rush fan than me?
I don't even think Rush likes their music so much.
I'm a huge Rush fan, and I was ecstatic to find a Rush album that I think is worthy. Well, I got to choose my words here carefully. A Rush album that has that high fidelity kind of sound. And Snakes and Arrows from Rush is a really great example of a pretty polished album, but staged properly, and it still sounds like Rush. I don't know how they do it. Like somehow it always sounds like them, because we have gone through their discography. I know you and I have, and there's so many different sounds and different albums and things, and somehow it always ends up sounding like them. But really, I had to pick one Rush album just because I'm such a huge Rush fan, but this is also another example of something that you can demo. I don't know if it's not the punchiest album, I think, in the mix, but there is enough low end there where on the drums where it is there. I think Neil's drums never sounded better on any of their mixes. I think that was perfect. Now, what I will say is it's not my favorite Rush album, not by a long shot. I don't even know if this is in my top 5 Rush albums. I think it's good. I think it's a good effort. Hold Your Fire is my favorite album. And everything from the 80s from them is pretty much a front to back album for me. But unfortunately, if you really sit down and you go in and listen to like Grace Under Pressure, or if you listen to Power Windows or Hold Your Fire, and you listen to how things are staged, it's staged like a tunnel. Everything is like way back there, and you're not really, everything kind of has like a veil over it. Nothing kind of sounds like it's in the room. Snakes and Arrows has that in the room sound. It sounds like it's right in front of you. It has that high fidelity sound. The guitars are crisp, the vocal is perfect, and the drums, I think Neil's drums sound great.
They do. And I remember when we went through that, most of their stuff, it's narrow, flat. It doesn't really feel like it's there with you, no matter what you listen to it on. I think the only early album that might be comparable is Fly By Night. I think it's remastered, though. That one had a wide sound to it, but Snakes and Arrows is definitely the standout album. The drums sound right, the guitars sound right. Everything feels good on that one. I have no complaints, really. But yeah, other than, it's not my favorite album either. I'm in the same boat. Like most of their 80s stuff, I can listen to front to back. Snakes and Arrows, I couldn't tell you one song on there. Right. I know it sounds good. So yeah, I know from their later stuff, and like kind of 90s on, they kind of became a lot more obscure. I don't know, they weren't really getting the radio play that they were, I guess. Well, they never really were considered a radio band. But then it's funny because once like I Love You Man came out, they got like all this recognition. All of a sudden it was cool to like Rush all of a sudden. But still their music, even the album they did after this never really quite got there as far as recognition goes. So it's kind of lost on a lot of people. That's why it's like this one, and also Alice in Chains, I kind of want to bring to light, that people can go and listen to this and get that experience, that high fidelity experience. Yeah. I feel like they did get, I remember hearing like Spirit of Radio and Tom Sawyer on the radio as a kid. They definitely had radio play, but yeah, I think before that movie though, they weren't quite as big. I don't know.
There's a whole thing we can go into about that, which I probably didn't want to, but
no,
but yeah, that's, I had to get a Rush album on there.
Respectable.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rush was a big part of my childhood too. That was like all I listened to for a long time in like elementary school. Remember, I would sit with headphones on and just listen to the CDs. I was like obsessed with them. And it wasn't for the guitar or anything. I just loved the songs. And yeah, back then I certainly wasn't paying attention to how good it sounded.
Right.
It wasn't a concern.
Yeah, I know that's going to be like a touchy one for people, but because I know Rush fans are some of the most dedicated fans out there, and things are what they are. You can't, if you can go back and remix everything, it'd be a different story.
Remix, remaster, re-record it.
It's just not reality, unfortunately. And
no,
when you take your heart out of the equation, you'll see that you can still love the music, but you can appreciate high fidelity. So
exactly.
All right, so take it away, Thrice.
I think it's their best sounding album. They're one of my favorite bands of all time, if not my favorite band of all time. It's my most listened to album this year, and it came out only a couple months ago. I looked up some stats actually on how many times I've listened to it, and the lowest track count I have is 40, meaning there's one song on there I listened to 40 times, and the most played is 80 times on one song. This album came out in September. So I've had it on pretty much repeat. I almost listen to it every day.
Interesting.
I have never been so, I wouldn't call it obsessed, but maybe that's probably a good word, but there's something about it that hooks you in. And I am listening also for the production quality now, because I just do that with everything, no matter what. But I think the cymbals stand out to me on this one. They're not swishy. They're always in, and they always sound right. Oftentimes they kind of get like lost, but even on an MP3, they still sound pretty good. The drums overall are punchy. The guitars sit well on top of them. Everything's down-tuned and chunky, and it just sounds good. Interestingly enough, this album, I think he's engineered their other ones too, the guitarist. And he recorded the album. I don't know if he mixed it, but he knows what he's doing. He knows how to get the tones that they want. I think the one guitar that he has, he built it himself and wound the pickups himself too. And I thought the guitar tone on this album is the best they've ever had.
Jeez.
I was looking at Dustin, he's the singer and he also plays guitar. His rig, I think, is all digital. He doesn't have a tube amp live, and he said he used it on most of the record, which was surprising to me because the guitar tone, I love it. And I didn't think digital things could sound that good as far as guitar goes. But apparently they can. So I thought that was stand out for me as a guitar player, to know the setup that he has and how good it can sound. He has like a stereo output from his guitar that goes into two different feeds, and then he can switch between them and blend them together between the pickups. It's kind of complicated, but I thought it was really cool. But performance-wise too, and themes, this is all like, I don't even know what to call this album. Metaphysical spirituality themed, I guess. I don't know. But I don't know if that even matters, because they kind of went back to like a cryptic method of songwriting, mostly. Some of their songs are a little bit more upfront again, but this is definitely a return to form. It's definitely their most complicated song structurally, or complicated album as far as the strong song structures go. So like all together, this album is a 10 out of 10 for me, and I still can't get enough of it. So
interesting. I don't think I'll ever be a Thrice guy, but I've heard what comes off of this album, and yes, it is extremely good. It's probably one of the best as far as recordings go and mixes go. It is a rawer sounding mix, I think, and it has that, sort of has like what I would call like that coffee house feel, like that stage in front of you type of feel. It's not a highly polished, big production sounding album like, other things we've been talking about, like Rush or something, which is just different. It's unique for it.
It is. You're right. It's not like comparing it to Hail to the King or Snakes and Arrows. It's not as sonically wide or big as that, but it still has girth.
Oh, yeah.
So they got it. It's still punchy, but it's not huge like that. So yeah, it still has that kind of indie alternative band feel, which they've most of the time kept that, I think. So it still sounds like them, but it still sounds new and like something else. Like the textures on it are, it's like dark, but not dark at the same time. It's hard to describe.
So when I went through this list, I remembered this album, and you have no idea what I'm going to say right now. This is an album that this band is not for the faint of heart or the easily offended.
Oh, I know what it's going to be.
It's the most ridiculously heavy music I've ever heard in my life. And it's not every day you find a deathcore album that sounds this good. The power, the girth. So this is Infant Annihilator.
I knew it.
And the band the album is called the Elysian Grandeval Galeriarch. I think that's how you say it. And the idea behind the term, the album name, is just that they wanted an abbreviated name that they could call the album The Egg. So it's Elysian and then Grandeval Galeriarch. But the names do tie into the album theme, which is basically abuse of power and how they exploit it through very violent means. So if you're somebody who's, now that you can understand a word that he's saying anyway, but if you're going to read along with the lyrics, it's a little rough. But I have never it's one of those bands where I just have never heard anything like it in my life. And the drumming is absolutely insane. I know there is some little tricks he does with double foot pedal and things like that. There's some controversies around that, but I don't even care. The album is pieced. It's I know it's the way it's run. It's sort of pieced together as they go. I don't think they don't play their songs as one whole and record it, but it comes together really nice, and it is extremely powerful and intense. And if you want to basically, blow your own head off with some music, put this on, because I think it's insane.
That is that's the only way I can describe it. It's the most insane music I've ever heard in my life, and it does sound good. It's mixed well, despite how chaotic it can sound, and just it's unlike anything you'll ever hear.
Yeah, I think that's the key to it, because if you listen to other things along this line, it usually either sounds very flat, or it can get very messy in the chorus. The guitars are just way too loud, or the drums just aren't done right. But for some reason, this is always on point, and the album is consistent throughout. I've listened to a lot of it, and not for the faint of heart, for sure.
No, but if you're not in that scene at all, it'll be a shock.
This is one of those things, though, where we're spanning how many genres here now? Between now this, Thrice, Alice in Chains, all these different things, and I want people to understand that you can appreciate an album that sounds really, really good. That even though it's not something you typically listen to, because I don't listen to any other deathcore.
No.
Not music like this. It's too much generally, but this album is fascinating to me from a performance and production sort of standpoint. I know. I had to get that one in there.
No, I'm not surprised, but it wasn't one I would have thought of either. It's a good pick. So my next album is Intervals. The album's called Circadian by Intervals. I'm pretty sure it's one guy who writes everything. It's all instrumental. I don't think he plays there. I think he just plays guitar on the tracks, but it's some of the best guitar playing I've ever heard. It's kind of like my perfect style of guitar playing. It's progressive, it's metal. There's a lot of like riffing, and just, I don't know how he plays a lot of it. Even when I watch him play it, it doesn't make sense of how good he is. The drum mix is what makes everything sound good, though. It's punchy, it's fast, the cymbals sound good. this album has girth for sure, as far as our vocabulary goes. It's a front to back album. I had to, like, in the list of 5 albums, this kind of paints a picture for me of like the range of things that I like, but also, I guess that's a good way to say it. The guitar playing. I don't have too many notes on this one other than that it's a very guitar centric album, obviously, and that's probably why I like it so much. The tone and guitar textures, I really love what he's done there. That's probably mostly why I listen to it, is for the guitar work and the way it sounds and the overall mix. I don't know, his earlier albums don't sound, this is definitely his best sounding one. The one before it is pretty good, but the drums have never sounded better. His guitar playing's never been better. That's really all I had.
Yeah, I've never heard any of it. I don't think it's ever. The album artwork doesn't look familiar at all, so it's something I'll have to check out. I
don't know if most people who don't play guitar or who don't like progressive kind of metal would probably get into it, but you can still appreciate the production quality and the musicianship, at least.
So this next one I picked because we've talked about it a little bit recently, and this band went to great lengths and a lot of money to make this album. So I had to pick it because of these reasons. Korn, Untouchables. When you read about this a little bit, they spent a lot of money and then put a lot of effort in to making this album basically their pinnacle album, and that's what they wanted to do. And again, well, let me say this other thing. Let me say a couple other things here first. This was the first album ever recorded in 96 kilohertz digital. Mm-hmm. It was a new thing. Now, with that being said, the album does have that digital sound to it, I think.
Yeah.
That is probably its only downfall, that it doesn't quite have that analog rawness to it. But everything in it is huge. The drums, I think, sound phenomenal. The guitars are massive. It rumbles. This album, it shakes when it's on. They claim they had 50 microphones recording the drums. I don't know if that's an overstatement. And they spent a month dialing in drum sounds to get it right, which is interesting to me. And I actually went back and I listened to it a little bit, and the drums are on point. The cymbals are right. The snare is right. The kick drum is right. It's laid out perfect. I think they did. I think it's that part of it is perfect. And the guitars are like, they sit perfect. They're right there. They're very raw sounding. It's got I don't know if Korn is exactly gent or not, but it might be sacrilege to say that. But perfect Korn sound. Unfortunately, it's not my favorite album. And I don't know if it's really anybody's favorite Korn album. I mean, for me, Issues is really where it was at for them. I was more of a fan, back in middle school, high school, I was more of a thing. But so again, unfortunately, I wish Issues sounded as good as this, or I wish some of the songs they had carried over onto this album, and they made an album like a year later, which is Take a Look in the Mirror, and there's songs on that I love that I wish ended up on this album, because this album sounds so good. Also, Jonathan Davis, he spent 6 months recording vocals on this. 6 months. Which for him was, apparently he used to just do it in like a week or two. He would just blow out the vocals, but it was like, no, if he wasn't sounding right, it was like, no, go home. This isn't, the right day for this. So he spent a long time. And I think it does show on this album that you can tell they took a lot of care, and his vocals do tend to be very raw, very emotional, but very raw. But this seems like it was a lot more refined, and they did everything right. They really did. They really wanted to make something for them that sounded really good. And I think they accomplished it.
I think they did too. It shows how much effort they put into it. I thought it was their best sounding album, but yeah, not all their best songs are on there. I think Korn, I would consider them like a new metal band, maybe back then.
Yeah.
They have elements of other things too, but no one else really sounds like them. Maybe like the Deftones is like, as far as like guitar and like the dark kind of feel goes, maybe they're similar, but Jonathan Davis is one in a million, meaning no one else sounds like he sounds.
Right.
I think he is the essence of Korn. So
I know the band they get a lot of hate for, I think, what they are, but they somehow have sort of, there was like this bottleneck that happened after like 2001, where there was only like 5 new metal bands that kind of came through and kept going. And Korn is one of them. They are still going, and their music doesn't really have quite that feel to it anymore. You know, there's a couple other ones too, like Disturbed and Papa Roach, you know, where they've kind of slipped through the cracks and kept going, which is interesting, but that's sort of a whole other conversation.
So my last album, Kings of Leon, When You See Yourself, also their most recent release. It's kind of interesting that most of these are, I think with the exception of Avenged Sevenfold, that's a little bit older. These are all within the last couple of years. But I guess hopefully as time goes, production quality and things get better. That's probably why I picked all these, because they're the most recent and they do sound the best. I picked Kings of Leon because it fits in with everything else. That album in particular, especially on vinyl, when you listen to it, it sounds like it's playing, it feels like it's in the room, that sound. Nothing ever falls out on the mix. It's a very mellow and warm sounding album as far as like the texture goes. They used a lot of synthesizer sounds. It's definitely a departure from what they're used to, which is probably why I like it, because I don't really consider myself a Kings of Leon fan. But this album's front to back for me. I can listen to the whole thing. I don't have really any complaints about it, except it's maybe a little too quiet, but that's kind of the point. It's not really a rock album. It's more of like a, I wouldn't know what to call it. But I don't have too many notes on it other than that.
Is this a Thrice band?
Maybe. They're like a mixture of Thrice and, like, if Thrice was from Louisiana, that's probably what they would sound like. I think they're from the South. I forget which state, but they definitely have a Southern, it's not country, but like that, like a Louisiana, it just reminds me of that kind of sound. Maybe Tennessee. I think that came out this year. It was earlier this year. That's an album I would play, like we said earlier, to set up a new stereo and let's see what this thing can do. I might have showed you that album at one point, or at least a song from it, but it's very different.
Interesting. I mean, as far as like their radio song, you know, "Sex on Fire" or whatever, is really the only one I know.
Yeah. Nothing like that.
I've never. I don't. You might have shown me things, but at this point, I'd have to go back and give it a listen. So, before I say what this is, any guesses on what my last one is?
Seether. No, probably not. We covered Rush, Infinite Annihilator. I don't know. I can't think of anything.
Periphery. So I and there's other albums out there, obviously, that I was considering for this list. I know you had more too.
Yeah, definitely.
I tried to pick albums that I had a little bit more to talk about, but this album, Hail Stan, Periphery 4, Hail Stan. I feel like Periphery does everything right. I don't know what it is about them. Like, I feel like they sort of set the bar in a way for what the type of music they are. They are like that gent band, but their music has got that really they're considered like technical metal, I guess. They have that technical feel, I think is what they call it. And I actually went back and I listened to a little bit of all their albums, and only their first album sounds average. It doesn't sound bad. It just sounds kind of average. Like they really just didn't quite have it dialed in yet, but it does have notable things about it. But pretty much every album after that sounds great. This one, I think, is their best sounding one. This has just like that slight raw edge to it with the drums. And it's loud, it's busy, but it's another one that I think it sets the marker. It never falters, and there's some really different, interesting songs on it. Not everything sounds exactly the same. I'm not a huge Periphery fan by any means. I'm really not. I mean, there's a few songs I really like, but this is another band where I think I think both of us have bands that people just don't really heard of a whole lot. And this is another one where people are like, who is that? But even going back, like their 2 or 3 albums before this, all were pretty good. Nothing sounded like trash. Everything was either at least average, above average, and then or better. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy their guitar tones and the way that their drums are laid out, the way they sound, very raw sounding, very in the room. I like the way it comes together.
Yeah, I'm on board with that album. I haven't really listened to their other stuff too much. I know a couple songs from that one I really like. I do like the drum sound on that and the guitar tone. The guitar sound, while I like the tone, I feel like there might have been a little, like I wish it cut just a little bit more. I feel like the guitar, I feel like it's there, but sometimes I feel like it's cloudy. I don't know how to describe it. Almost like that one Deftones album we listened to where it's like the guitar is loud, I just can't hear it very well, and I don't know why. Like maybe there's too much bass that's overriding some more of they didn't bring out the bite that it should have, but overall still one of the better guitar tones and sounds. I'm being extra critical of that one. Sure. I've listened to that one song a lot, but
yeah, I say if you're gonna venture out on Periphery, that song "It's Only Smiles" is that song really does it for me. I don't know what it is. It's
a catchy song.
It really is.
It's got a good rhythm to it.
It almost should be on the radio kind of thing, but I guess it's a bit heavier than typical radio rock. But venture out on that one and give it a listen. Yeah, not much more to say there on that, but one thing I did want to say is that I think from anybody watching this is going to see that our styles of music are like completely different. You know, the bands you picked are totally different than mine, but we still are, you know, kind of coming together and finding this common ground with music that's mixed right. You know, it's that appreciation for it. But like our tastes couldn't be more different, really. I mean, it's rock based, but beyond that,
there's some overlap. Like I like Alice in Chains and I like Periphery and Rush, obviously. But yeah, the albums we picked, if you were to put them side by side, it would be like they're very different.
Yeah,
holistically.
Yeah.
That's all I got.